So first of all, hi everybody, and thank you so much for joining us tonight for this very, very exciting Dutchess County Historical Society presentation. Why is it especially exciting? This is the first one we are doing from our new home here on Route 9 up in Rhinebeck. This place is awesome. I wish I could take the camera around and show you what it all looks like, because there are wonderful artifacts on display all over the place, different reading rooms. It's absolutely fantastic. I encourage, if you haven't been here, please take the time to, whenever you're on Route 9, come on up to Rhinebeck. It's right just across the road from the cemetery on the south side of town. Fantastic location, fantastic event here. I have the privilege to be able to talk about Dutchess County soldiers in the Civil War. And so without further ado, I think I'm going to jump straight into the slideshow, and we will go from there. I'm going to share the screen. If I can be smarter than the computer, which sometimes can be a challenge. Okay, I'm sharing the screen. Can everybody see the first slide, the cover slide that has the neither unappreciated nor forgotten?
Yes.
I'm going to pick on, okay, great. Thank you, Rhonda. I was going to pick on Peter because he's on my screen and I can see his face. And I was going to ask for a thumbs up, but all right, he's smiling, so that's a good sign. Before we get going, though, there are a few thank yous that I have to make, because this would not be possible. This presentation would not be possible without the hard work and dedication of a number of folks. First of all, once again, CR Properties, Tom Servone, you folks are absolutely wonderful. They have dedicated a lot of time, resources, energy to supporting the Historical Society. CR Properties has been a supporter of my research into the Civil War here for a couple of iterations now. So what this really is the third in the CR Properties historical series on Dutchess County and the Civil War. And I can't thank Tom enough for supporting the society this way. I also have to give a special thanks to Danny Masterson and the Wappingers Falls Historical Society at the Messier Homestead. They have a nice collection there, and I was able to find some wonderful documents on the 57th New York Infantry Regiment, and I'll talk about those as we go through the presentation. I really want to thank a couple of the people who are actually here tonight, Bill Jeffway and Melody and Lenny Moore, who put in more hours than I think there are in a day to make this place our home, to make events like this possible, to make artifacts and resources available that you just did not think exist. So thank you to them. And finally, another person who's here tonight, my dear wife, Connie, who has had to put up with me talking about history stuff for the last 30 some odd years, but who has always been supportive. So thank you. And my dad is also out there in the audience, and I've been blessed to have a family that has supported my historical endeavor since day one. So a lot of people to thank. So now let's start talking about Gettysburg. Gettysburg represents a very particular challenge when wanting to talk about the Civil War. Why? Well, we decided to do this, and I should give a shout out to Andy Villani. He's like, well, why don't you do Gettysburg? It's the 160th anniversary. It's a great time. He's absolutely right. But Gettysburg, the last couple of these I've done have been on Averisboro, have been on the Shenandoah, so 3rd Winchester and Cedar Creek. Those are not well-known Civil War battles. And so it's refreshing to talk about those battles and Dutchess County's involvement in them. Gettysburg is huge. Gettysburg is iconic. It is well known. It is big. It is geographically spread out. It represents a different type of challenge. As I'm putting this together, the thing that kept going through my mind was, how do I balance out the big picture of what Gettysburg is to make sure we focus on the local flavor of the battlefield? And the way we're going to do that is this. We're going to start focusing on some aspects of the battle that specifically involved Dutchess County soldiers, where they fought, how they fought, who they were, where they fit into the county as a whole. That does not mean inclusive. We're going to talk about every single unit that had a Dutchess County soldier in it. I have found references to Dutchess County soldiers at Gettysburg from the 65th and the 95th New York, from the 3rd United States Infantry. We aren't going to be talking about those regiments. There just isn't time, and I want to focus on a few particular aspects that I think are, quite fascinating, to be honest. So I've selected 4 particular units to talk about. Of course, we're going to be talking about the 150th New York, the Dutchess County Regiment. But we're also going to be talking about the 57th New York that had 3 companies in it from Dutchess County. We're going to be talking about the 80th New York, the 20th New York State Militia, same unit. There's a story there. And I found a very interesting story about the 111th New York, which is actually a unit from up in the Rochester area, but has what I think is, again, kind of an interesting Dutchess County connection. We'll talk about that too. And so I'm going to be focusing on those units' experiences. Some elements of Gettysburg are not going to be discussed. So we won't be talking about the big, Little Round Top or Big Round Top. We won't really be talking about Devil's Den. Cemetery Hill doesn't play a big role in the fight. The Peach Orchard, the Wheat Field. Oh yeah, we're going to be talking a lot about them. Pickett's Charge, a little bit. A lot of action on the first day. Culp's Hill, absolutely. So that's the framework I was going through in laying out this presentation. So with that, I want to briefly talk about how I came up with this title, Neither Unappreciated Nor Forgotten. And it comes from, if I can be smarter, there we go. In 1889, you know what? Let me get a laser pointer. In 1889, the 150th New York dedicated one of their 2 monuments at Gettysburg. And at that dedication ceremony, General John H. Ketchum, who's a colonel commanding the regiment at Gettysburg, gave remarks. And one of his remarks kind of struck me. And I've got it quoted in full here, but the last sentence is the one that got me. Attest that your sufferings and sacrifices are not unappreciated and forgotten. He's speaking to the veterans of the 150th. But to me, it almost had resonance when I'm like, what about the other soldiers from Dutchess County? We don't want to forget them either. I want to make sure they understand that they are not, their memory, they are not unappreciated. They are not forgotten either. And so it's sort of a dedication to all of those Dutchess soldiers who maybe didn't have the sexy positions during the Battle of Gettysburg, but who played critical roles in that battle. That's where I came up with it. Now, Gettysburg itself, I don't think this is anything earth-shattering, but I'd like to give just sort of a brief overview of the campaign and the battle. This will be very quick. I think everybody is fairly familiar, but after the Battle of Chancellorsville in early May, Lee is authorized by the Confederate government to invade the North. He made the suggestion, it is approved, and he's got what is perhaps the biggest force that the Army of Northern Virginia has during the war, the most potent force. It's about 80,000 men divided into 3 corps. It's a new unit organization. And they've really got 4 goals of this campaign. Number 1, to relieve pressure on Richmond and Northern Virginia that's been fought over for the last 12 to 18 months, fairly much nonstop. To exploit any resources they can acquire in Pennsylvania, to maybe capture a key northern city, and by doing so, get British support for the war effort. And finally, to boost Confederate morale. There's bad news in May and June coming out of the West. So maybe there's things we can do to get the population back in good spirits. Things look fairly bright. For the Union, not so much. General Joseph Hooker, who was widely viewed as perhaps the right general who could beat Lee, was defeated soundly at Chancellorsville, after which he and Lincoln started butting heads about the direction of the army. Hooker wanted to focus far more on Richmond, wasn't really worried about Lee going into Virginia. The disagreements between the two got so severe that on the 28th of June, Hooker offers to resign. Lincoln accepts it and appoints General George Gordon Meade as his successor to command the Army of the Potomac on the 28th of June, just a few days before the battle. Meade was surprised by the calling, decided that he was going to try to consolidate the Army of the Potomac as quickly as he could in southern Pennsylvania. The Army of the Potomac is at this stage still a very potent force, but its organization is also undergoing changes. As results of the Battle of Chancellorsville have depleted some units. There are new units coming from other places in the north throughout Maryland, from the Washington defenses, to try to augment the Army. And so we start to see kind of a conglomerate force. And there's some examples of these Dutchess County units being part of that, and those different relationships being important. The battle started on the 1st of July as a fight between a detachment of Union cavalry and a Confederate brigade on the northwest side of town that gradually over the first day developed into a fight between elements of 2 Confederate and 3 Union corps. The Confederates won the first day and pushed the Union troops to the southeast of town, where they occupied defenses on a fish hook-shaped ridge line, high ground in that area. The second day of the battle, General Lee ordered an assault on the Union left. This is the attack on Little Round Top, Devil's Den. As part of this defensive system, the Union troops were mismanaged and put in a very untenable position, particularly the 3 Corps under Daniel Sickles, a Hudson Valley politician, which led to fierce fighting in the Peach Orchard and the wheat field. The Union line held. And on the third day, Robert E. Lee ordered a massive charge against the center of the Union line, as we know as Pickett's Charge, with a secondary assault on Culp's Hill earlier in the morning. By the time we get to the 3rd of July, the majority of both armies have consolidated on the battlefield, and 83,000 Union troops are facing 75,000 Confederate troops. Just by the end of the second day, if we took casualties only until that point, the first 2 days of Gettysburg are the costliest battle of the Civil War. By the time you add the third day into the mix, you have 23,000 Union casualties and 28,000 Confederate casualties. Over 51,000 men are killed, wounded, missing, captured at Gettysburg. It is the bloodiest battle in North American history. Lee retreats, the invasion is over with. To look at the specifics of the battle now, we're going to move on to events of the first day. Now, what I have here is just a general map that shows an overview of the positions at the height of the fighting. And we do have one regiment that has a lot of Dutchess County soldiers, a large number of Dutchess County soldiers in it, and that is the 80th New York Infantry that fights in about this position right here. Now, the 80th New York is a very interesting unit. And what I mean by that is it was originally known as the 20th New York State Militia. This is a picture of its monument at Gettysburg. And you'll notice it says the 80th New York Infantry, but then at the top, the Ulster Guard, 20th New York State Militia. This was a militia unit initially founded at 1851. Primarily made up of people from Ulster County, but with a lot of representation from the surrounding counties as well. There were a lot of people in that unit who had a fond connection to the 20th New York State Militia and signed up immediately upon the beginning of the war. The 20th New York State Militia was organized as a 3-month regiment. It, spent a couple months on guard duty in Maryland, and then it came home and it was disbanded. And immediately upon being disbanded, it was authorized for renewal or reformation as a new regiment, same leadership. And Once this unit was created in September and October of 1861, it received a new designation, the 80th New York Infantry. Well, that was a problem because, first of all, the soldiers, what the heck is this? We aren't, the 80th New York Volunteers. We didn't, we've been in the state militia. We've been in the 20th New York State Militia for 10 years. That's our unit. Also, for officers, they were not given any backdated date of rank for their service in the 20th New York. Everything started fresh. So officers that had significant seniority because of months or years with the 20th New York had to start from zero, and they found themselves subordinate to a lot of other officers. This caused quite a bit of headbutting back and forth. George Pratt, the first colonel of the regiment, in December of 1861, wrote the below to the New York State adjutant. Sorry, I can't talk tonight. Adjutant General, saying, "I have no commission, nor is any other person to my knowledge, to act in or for the 80th New York." We aren't New York. We're the 20th New York State Militia. We don't have a volunteer designation. It's basically calling out the governor for, why are you doing this to us? This debate drug on for about a year, and it was only ended when the New York State Adjutant General Isaac Vanderpool wrote back to Colonel Theodore Gates in early 1863 that basically saying, okay, we're going to recognize you as the 20th New York State Militia. For organizational purposes, officially, we're still going to call you the 80th, but we understand there's going to be brackets. We will acknowledge your existence there. The 80th or 20th, which I'm going to call them the 80th for continuity's sake, though the veterans might not be happy with me. Another reason that this occurred was Colonel Pratt, the gentleman who fought so hard for him, he had been killed at Second Bull Run, where this unit, the 80th New York, suffered very heavy casualties. Throughout the course of the war, the 80th New York suffered 553 combat casualties, killed, wounded, and missing. At Gettysburg, what we're going to talk about, they went into the battle with 287 men. 170 of them were lost, over a 50% casualty rate at Gettysburg. They were what's called one of the fighting 300 regiments, the regiments that lost over 300 men during the 300 highest losing regiments for the Union Army during the war. They, as I mentioned, they also lost heavily at Second Bull Run. They were also in the thick of things at Antietam and at Fredericksburg. As I mentioned, Dutchess County was well represented in this unit. I wish as we all know, when we study history, there's always unanswered questions. And I feel like I've only scratched the surface, but I've been able to identify through adjutant general reports, muster rolls, over 80 soldiers from Dutchess County who served in the ranks of the 80th New York, over 20 of whom served at Gettysburg specifically. I am sure the number is higher, but based on what I have been able to physically document, that's the extent of what I have. And those men performed phenomenal service. The battle itself, one of the challenges that the 80th had is, if you look here, the brigade that they're in, they are thrown into the battle relatively early on the 1st of July. This unit right here is the Iron Brigade, which earned lasting glory at Gettysburg. But if you look at the layout of this map, the Confederates have a significant advantage over the Union. The other advantage that they have is that if you look at this brigade, kind of hard to see on this map, but 121st Pennsylvania, 142nd Pennsylvania, 151st Pennsylvania. This is a Pennsylvania brigade. The 80th was assigned to it on the 27th of June. Just arrived with this brigade. Why was this New York brigade put in with these guys from Pennsylvania, which is kind of an odd mixture. Well, those other three regiments had never been in battle before. They were brand new regiments. The 80th was added because they had combat experience and they might be able to steady the fighting. Unfortunately, they were in a very, very tough situation. And as the day went on, you can see the situation about 3 o'clock. The 80th becomes a little bit separated. The 80th was actually holding their own against a very talented organization, the 47th North Carolina, very experienced Confederate regiment. But the other Pennsylvania regiments were forced back by superior numbers, by inefficiency in their command and control. And the 80th ended up getting kind of chopped between the 47th and the 52nd North Carolina, driven back to Seminary Ridge, where they were on the far left-hand side of the line. This is about 4:45 in the afternoon. From there, the same thing happened. The 121st Pennsylvania, the same unit that was on their left earlier, is on their left again. They are outflanked by some South Carolina regiments, and the 80th is forced to flee back to Cemetery Hill. And the 2nd of July was kind of quiet for them. I'm not going to read those quotes there from the commanding officer, but so that's what's going on with the 80th. Now, I want to take a look at some Dutchess County soldiers here. Where are some Dutchess County connections? The service record for Isaac Thomas, G Company. It's up in the left. Now, if you look at that document, there's nothing really indicating a Dutchess County connection there, but we do know that he resided in Poughkeepsie when he initially enlisted in 1871. This is his service record that shows his re-enlistment as a veteran serviceman in February of 1864. Beyond that, we don't know much about him. James Westcott. We do know that this gentleman was born in Plattekill. He died in Rosendale, but he lived as a young man in Poughkeepsie. And it was while he was in Poughkeepsie that he enlisted in the 80th, in B Company. He was shot in the left hip during the fight that I just talked about on the 1st of July. Down here at the bottom, just a very short entry. This is honestly all I can find out about this young private. Private Francis Lee, he was 19 years old. He was from Poughkeepsie, and he was killed at Gettysburg on the 1st of July. We know a little bit more about this gentleman, George A. Mann, Second Lieutenant George A. Mann in Company H. He was from Rhinebeck. One of the things that we see is a lot of the soldiers who enlisted from the northern part of the country would tend to go to Kingston to enlist. Probably closer or easier in many cases than Poughkeepsie. George Mann was one of those cases. He enlisted in enlisted in Kingston, but he lived in Rhinebeck. And he went through the war fighting in most of the major battles. He was promoted to corporal, then sergeant, then first sergeant, then commissary sergeant. Finally, at the very end of the war, he was promoted to second lieutenant. He made it through Gettysburg unscathed, uninjured. And then after the war, he returned to Rhinebeck and lived there as, depending on the year, some of the census reports call him a farmer, some of them call him a laborer. But married a wife, Kate, and he had 7 children, 2 sons and 5 daughters, lived in Rhinebeck until he died in 1899. Another gentleman from the county, Charles McNiff. Now, Charles McNiff, a couple things about him. First of all, I should say this is the Tivoli graveyard, the cemetery. He's buried up in Tivoli. You can see Company B, 80th New York Volunteers. We know a little bit more about this guy. We know that he was wounded at Fredericksburg and also at Gettysburg. We don't know which date. We don't know whether he was wounded on the 1st or during the fight against the Confederates at Pickett's Charge, which we'll talk about later on. But we do know he was wounded. We also know that he was a tinsmith. This is according to the 1892 census. And you see up here that his place of residence and enlistment was Red Hook. He also enlisted in Kingston, but he lived his life in Red Hook. Specifically, he lived over in Tivoli. We have census records that indicated that he lived where in the town of Tivoli now. The address was Red Hook when he filled out the paperwork. That was Red Hook. But he's another one that made it through the Battle of Gettysburg with just minor injuries. That takes us through the first day. The second day, we've got a few more things, a few more different units to talk about. Sorry, I've got to get my notes organized here as we go along. Always a challenge. And in this case, we're going to talk about 3 units in particular. Actually, a little bit on a fourth too, but not very much. First one we're going to talk about is the 57th New York. This is the unit I was talking about earlier that had three companies from Wappingers Falls. But we're also going to talk a little brief story about the 111th New York, and then we're going to talk about the actions of the 150th New York on the second day of Gettysburg. And there's I don't want to say a funny story, but a very interesting story to relate about what happened to them on the second. So let's start with the 57th New York. This is a unit that was made up, it was a conglomerate of a number of different units that was formed, again, early in the war, 3-year volunteers between the 12th of August and the 19th of November in 1861. Some of the units had, fancy militia names, the National Guard Rifles, the Clinton Rifles, the United States Voltigeurs, Zooks Voltigeurs, and they came from a variety of different places. About half of the regiment was from New York City. There was a regiment that was from Utica. There was another regiment from Kings County, but companies H, I, and K came from Dutchess County. And during the course of the war, those 3 companies had about 270 men on their rosters. Now, obviously, not all of them came from Dutchess County, but again, I can confirm that a large, based on what I've read and what I've been able to determine, a large number of them did. Again, I'm looking at my notes, over about 70 of them, of which, again, over 20, I can confirm fought at Gettysburg. From Dutchess County in those 3 regiments. It's even more kind of surprising when I tell you that this regiment was very under strength getting to Gettysburg. Only 175 soldiers in the regiment at Gettysburg. They suffered 34 casualties, and I'll talk about that as we go. This was another unit that suffered significant casualties throughout the war. 505 combat casualties, killed, wounded, captured, missing. The heaviest losses this unit experienced were at Antietam, and some of the things I've discovered, I want to do another project on the 57th at Antietam. But they also suffered significant losses during the 7 Days battles at Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, the Wilderness, and a couple of the assaults on Petersburg. They also suffered some casualties there. Now at Gettysburg, they sort of had a similar experience to the 80th in that they were grouped with relatively unfamiliar faces. They were put in a brigade with 3 other New York regiments that were small but had a lot of experience, and one really, really big Pennsylvania regiment that had never been in battle before. And they were one of these units that after Meade took over were furthest away from the gathering point in southern Pennsylvania. And they had to march a long way. Reports say that over the 3 days that it took to get there, the 29th and 30th of June and the 1st of July, on the 29th of June and on the 1st of July, they marched over 30 miles. This is in July. It was hot. On the 29th, there was a big thunderstorm, which didn't help matters, but it was miserable. They are finally arrive on the battlefield right behind Cemetery Ridge at about 10 a.m. on the morning of the 2nd. And that's where they stay while they're resting and getting ready. Now, I had mentioned at the outset that a lot of the action on the first day involved a problematic deployment of Union forces far forward of the main Union defensive line. And the Confederates attacked this very awkward placement of Union soldiers with tremendous effect. And it was an all hands on deck, throw whatever units you can get into the fight in order to try to stem the Confederate tide. The 57, and this is a picture of about 4 o'clock in the afternoon on the 2nd, what the unit line looked like. And you can see just how spread out the Union line is and how compact and how dense the Confederate line is. The 57th is in one of the first brigades to arrive on the scene to help. Now, what I've just done very briefly in this map is just to highlight the peach orchard and the wheat field, which are two of the locations on the Gettysburg battlefield that have gone down in infamy and fame as being two of the hardest fought over places on the entire battlefield. General John Caldwell's division, of the Second Corps, is where the 57th belongs to. They are in the forefront of this division. They're in the 1st Brigade that is marching to aid the 3rd Corps in defending the wheat field. But when they are sent into battle, if you look, they are, here's the wheat field, here's the peach orchard, there's the 57th in New York. It's other regiments, the 66th and the 52nd. Those are the smaller, other experienced regiments. The 140th, I should also add, the 52nd and the 66th both have about the same number of soldiers as the 57th. They're under 200 men. The 140th has over 600, but they've never been in combat before. And again, you can see this is the regimental history where they talk about the fighting in the peach orchard and in the wheat field. The 57th, as we're going to see, is sort of in between both of those areas. That's where they're at. I pointed it out to you. About half an hour, 45 minutes after arrival, they have managed to advance through the wheat field into the peach orchard. The problem is that they are getting ready to be outflanked by fresh Confederate forces, which is exactly what happens in the next slide, where we see the 57th fleeing the wheat field along with the rest of the unit. Now, one of the things that should be pointed out, to their credit, the 57th they were relied on to sort of hold the ground a little bit in the face of particularly the Pennsylvania regiment fleeing. You can kind of see that the other two experienced New York regiments are much further to the south. The 57th is backstopping this Pennsylvania regiment. And they are able to basically conduct a fighting withdrawal. They have to retreat. They are forced back, but it is never a rout. They are not driven from the field in a panic. And, you can kind of see it up here. I can't actually see it because I've got the screen bar up, but the commander of the regiment is giving his report on what happened and saying that very same fact. Martin Van Buren Brouwer. Want to talk a minute about this gentleman. He commanded Company K in the 57th New York New York Volunteers. He was at Gettysburg. This is a picture of his grave in the Wappingers Rural Cemetery. Now, as a bit of a digression, back in October, and this is where I really got to thank Danny Masterson and the Wappingers Historical Society. They put on a program called Stones and Bones, which was a graveyard tour of, characters dressed up as these historical figures and telling their story. I was fortunate enough to be able to represent Martin Van Buren Brouwer at that event. The Mizzier homestead, the Wappingers Historical Society, has the Brower papers. They have his letters from the Civil War. They have a number of documents relating to his life. And it is fascinating because this is a man who fought through the war. He was injured twice. First at the Battle of Blackburn's Ford in 1861, right outside of Bull Run, or right before the Battle of Bull Run. Then toward the end of the war, he was wounded at the Battle of Deep Bottom, Virginia in June of 1864, which was one of the battles around St. Petersburg. He was actually wounded bad enough that he was unable to rejoin his regiment before they mustered out of service in September of that year. He was a shoemaker. His father had been a shoemaker in Poughkeepsie. He learned the craft of shoemaking along with his brother from his father. And in 1860, his father sent him down to New York City to apprentice with a shoemaker. He did so, and that's where he was when Fort Sumter was fired on by Confederate forces starting the war. Martin Van Buren Brower enlisted right away, so quickly that he didn't have a chance to talk to his parents. One of his early letters says, and I'm paraphrasing, but yeah, my sister Kate was not very happy with me that I enlisted without talking to her. I really had to plead my case and say she should be proud having a brother who is willing to lay down his life for the sake of other men and for his country. He went on to serve gallantly in multiple other battles, was mentioned in dispatches at the Battle of Antietam. After the war, he went back to the city, started off as a police officer, didn't like it, it didn't fit, started his own shoe company, was very successful, started to see problems with increased industrialization, that quality artisanal shoemakers are being forced out of business. So he worked hard for unions. He became a big union organizer. By the late 1800s, very successful down in the city, but a fire burned out his business, and he and his second wife moved back up to Dutchess County, where he spent about the last 5 to 8 years of his life. His son, Albert, went on to become another union leader and a leader of the New York Socialist Party here in Dutchess County, in Wappingers Falls, in fact. But it was here in Dutchess County that Martin Brower passed away. But a truly fascinating character, not only in the war, but also in labor history here in the county as well. And so that's a picture of him there on the left, as well as his gravestone. A couple of the elements here from the Brower papers down at Wappingers Falls. Excuse me. One of them is just to note, this is his pension, showing that he was approved for a pension, serving as a lieutenant in Company K of the 57th Regiment. $6 a month. Ooh, got it. And then also over here, I included this just as a bit of an interest. In the Brower papers, there's not many from 62 and 63. There's a lot from 61 and a lot from 64. This is one of the few from 63, and it's the monthly return for his company, Company K, on the 30th of May. And the reason I include it is just to talk about the size of some of these companies. The 57th they've been fought out quite a bit. And they had 44 men present for duty, of which 12 were detached. And that's in May. So you had some long marches. They are going to be below that, probably no more than about 30 men in that company at the most by the time we get to Gettysburg. Couple other soldiers who fought. This is William Mosier. This is his gravestone in the Poughkeepsie Rural Cemetery. Says he was a carpenter. I got to be honest, I have no idea what a preaser is, which is what I think that word is. His son is a clerk. And I just highlight here that he was present for duty on the 30th of June, 1863. William Mosier he was also wounded at the Battle of Deep Bottom, the same battle that Brower was wounded at. After the war, he came back to Poughkeepsie. He actually lived in LaGrange. married Josephine Dusenberry from Poughkeepsie, and lived the rest of his life either in LaGrange or Poughkeepsie until he passed away in 1950. Now, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on Joseph Freer, not because he isn't worthy of spending time on, but he was not at Gettysburg. He was a soldier in the 57th as well. But if you look at here, there's a lot of absent, sick, absent, sick, absent. There's hospital, absent, sick. He was finally discharged for disability in August of 64. But one of the things I find very interesting is, as massive as the Dutchess County, as the Poughkeepsie Rural Cemetery is, this is Joseph Freer's grave, and that's the grave of William Mosher that I just showed you. They are right next to each other, and there's no familial connection that I'm aware of. The 7th New Jersey. What the heck is a New Jersey regiment doing in this discussion about Dutchess County? And the short answer is, I don't know, because this is one of those unanswered historical questions that I can't figure out. The 7th New Jersey was a regiment that fought in the Peach Orchard, very, very close to the 57th New York. But when doing research, I came up with a couple things. On the right, at St. Paul's Cemetery in Red Hook, there is the gravestone for Corporal John Martin from the 7th New Jersey, who died on the 3rd of January, 1862. And then to the left is a newspaper clipping from the Red Hook Advertiser, 30 July, 1863. Sergeant E.R. Holt of the 7th New Jersey Regiment is in town, having received a wound in the hand at the Battle of Gettysburg. Has returned on furlough to his home. He looks healthy and has every appearance of a good soldier. Why are 2 soldiers from Red Hook in the 7th New Jersey? To me, as a historian, there is an interesting story there. There's a question. I don't know whether we'll ever get an answer, but I just found that kind of fascinating. What is the connection? And this, I should say, the 7th New Jersey, this is a regiment from around Philadelphia. It was primarily raised in Trenton. So it's not like this is something that was up in Newark or Ramapo or somewhere like that. This is Central Jersey. So just something interesting. The 111th New York. One of the things that I find fascinating about the 111th New York, why it's included in here, is simply for one soldier. Because the 111th, this is a regiment from Rochester. It has some very interesting pedigrees, though. It had a very, very bad reputation in the war. It suffered 1,803 battle casualties during the war. The majority of them captured, because this regiment was formed on the 24th of August, and it's of 1862. And its first place it was stationed, Harper's Ferry, Virginia, West Virginia, where after less than a month in service, it was captured en masse, 983 men, as a brand new regiment during Lee's first invasion of the North. They were paroled. Their first battle was Gettysburg. They were this, and the whole brigade, the other elements there, the 125th and the 126th New York here, were in the same boat. So the 111th, but real quick, the rest of the war, this unit suffered 404 soldiers killed or died of wound in the war. It was one of the top 5 heaviest losses of dead or wounded in the war of any New York regiment. Tremendous casualties, particularly in the wilderness in Spotsylvania, as well as around Petersburg. The reason I'm including it in here, though, is the actions of Willard's brigade. I don't want to go too much into it, but you see 3 Union regiments here, along with the 1st Minnesota and the 19th Maine, stopping 3 Confederate brigades. This was a last gasp effort. And it was considered sort of a forlorn hope, this plugging the line in the Union line about 6 o'clock in the evening on the 2nd. They did it. The 111th went into this fight with about 390 men, and they lost 185 of them in the charge that's depicted here. Next to them, the 1st Minnesota, went into the charge with 262 men, lost 215, 82% casualty rate in less than 10 minutes, the largest single casualty count of any Union regiment in any single battle in the war. And the 111th was right next to him and got it bad as well. What's the connection to Dutchess County? It's this guy. As I'm walking through the Red Hook Cemetery, I see this rather imposing gravestone. I actually saw this a couple years ago and just did the research on it in the last couple months for Edward Parsons from Company E of the 111th New York Volunteer Infantry. So why in the world, what is he doing? What is he doing here in Red Hook? Well, the short answer is he was a farmer up by Rochester, farmed with his brothers until 1879 when he married Elizabeth Shook from Red Hook. Moved to Red Hook, settled down, started as a farmer, eventually became a bank cashier and worked in the bank. By 1910, he was established there. I have not been able to identify that he had any children, but he was wealthy enough that he and his wife lived with a 21-year-old servant in their house. And he died in 1918. Looking at the wrong sheet here. So I just find that a very interesting, how did somebody from Rochester end up here? Well, he met the love of his life. The 150th New York. Now, this is the one that most folks are probably most familiar with. This picture, I've got two pictures of the other Dutchess County monument. The 150th is a rare unit that has two monuments at Gettysburg. This is the big one. And on the left is its dedication in 1888. On the right, down here, I was blessed about 4 years ago to have a group of students in my History 218 Civil War America class that, as part of the class, we go to Antietam. And they enjoyed it so much, they're like, hey, over the summer, on our own dime, let's go down to Gettysburg. And so the six of us, well, Connie was there with us as well, but we went down and did a staff ride at Gettysburg. We spent a couple days down there on the battlefield. And this was just a fun and wonderful group of students. And these two are now engaged, which is kind of cool too. But had a picture of them taken at the Dutchess County Regimental Monument as well. A lot of you have seen this picture before. I just thought I'd put it in here to show you the Dutchess County Regiment. Now, another thing we need to look at for the 150th New York, and in the absence of time here, I see that I've got just a little over 10 minutes to go. I'm not going to go through the long history of the 150th. I am just going to note that they were, the unit was founded in August of 1862 from Dutchess County. There was a tremendous desire to have a regiment from the county. They formed up, and it was pretty easy to get a county regimental designation. And they mustered in October of 1862, John H. Ketchum commanding, and they spent their first 8 months guarding stuff in Baltimore. When the invasion started, they were grouped with an ad hoc brigade under a guy by the name of Henry Lockwood, with 2 Maryland Home Guard units. These were 3 regiments, had never been under fire before. All of them were pretty large. The 150th took 609 men into Gettysburg. One of the Maryland regiments took 700, the other took 500. This is a pretty big organization. And just like some of the other organizations I've talked about, they marched it was a long, hard march to get to the battlefield. They finally got to the battlefield. Excuse me. There we go. That's what I'm looking for. They arrived at the battlefield finally on the morning of the 2nd of July. And they were placed in position right here. Now, I've got the big map and the small map, or in the smaller inset map here. They were sitting behind Spangler's Spring, behind Culp's Hill. with a number of other units. One of the advantages the Union had in this battle was what we call interior lines. In other words, it's much easier to move troops within this circle than it is to move in exterior lines for the Confederates. And what we see happen with the 150th is typical of a number of units. They do a lot of marching. They marched overnight. They finally arrived at 8 o'clock in the morning. During the day, they moved a number of times in this same vicinity based on the ebb and flow of the battle. Finally, at 5 o'clock on the afternoon of the 2nd, they are ordered to go help out this fight. And they go. They march along the Granite Schoolhouse Road, which is this road right here. And they arrive just immediately to the left of the 111th. The big fight at the time they arrive on the battlefield is going on to their north. But the 150th is given the mission of attacking a Confederate unit that is advancing down the Trostle Farm Lane and to recover some lost cannon. Now, they are in the second line behind the 1st Maryland Home Guard, and they're going up against the 21st Mississippi, an experienced unit that got lost and separated from its home brigade, which is this one over here. I've got a quote from Peter Funk, who's a private in F Company, the 150th. He's a character. If you get a chance to read his diaries, they are entertaining. He's got a flair for the English language. We formed into a line of battle with the 1st Maryland Regiment, and with 3 cheers dashed on to the rebel lines, which at the sight of fresh troops fell back in confusion. There's a little exaggeration there. Our lieutenant colonel with the detail drew off the 2 pieces of cannon, and we fell back to our former positions. Now, this whole event, this capturing, this retaking of the cannons, became kind of a thing. On August the 30th, Captain Robert Connell, and I'm going to go back to that slide I just had in a minute. Captain Robert Connell from B Company wrote a letter to be published in the Poughkeepsie Journal, or excuse me, the Poughkeepsie Eagle. And you see here the Poughkeepsie Eagle in September 14th, 1863. It is published. I'm going to go on a brief aside. I don't want to go on too many tangents, but I just got to say, here's one case where Bill Jeffway is amazing. Think we can find Poughkeepsie Eagle records from 1863? Can't find them digitally. There's a number of databases that has old newspapers. They aren't there. Bill found some as part of the move, hard copies of the Poughkeepsie Daily Eagle from 1863. They're here at the Historical Society. I don't know whether anybody else has got them. Maybe the Adriance Library, but I haven't seen them anywhere else. And was able to dig through these newspapers and thought this was a very interesting letter. Now, I'm going to go to the next slide fairly quickly, but I do want to just highlight that he's saying basically, permit me through your paper to inform the friends of the 150th Regiment, as well as the public, in the taking of 4 brass guns, not 2, 4 brass guns on the evening of the 2nd July. And he goes on to detail how, Companies B and G were ordered to bring the guns in, but through some misunderstanding, however, Company G did not go. So it was only B Company. Did I mention that the guy writing this was the commander of B Company? He may have an agenda. Who knows? And that's him in the upper left-hand corner, Robert O'Connell. But then down here, a few days afterwards, however, to our astonishment, we saw in a Baltimore paper a letter from the captain of Company B, 1st Maryland Regiment, taking credit for saving the battery to himself and company. Which statement is altogether false, as can be certified by the captain of the battery. I do not see why so many are anxious to take the credit of saving these guns. Company B of the 150th Regiment was detailed for that purpose and did the duty assigned them, and the honor is justly due to its officers and members and to none others. For my part, I care not for the honor, but I will not stand by and see my men robbed of what they are justly entitled to. Of course not. Gotta love that letter. And then a couple days later, a little bit earlier, in August 4th, this little brief blurb appeared. We understand from Lieutenant Mooney, who was in the Battle of Gettysburg, that while the fortunes of the day were trembling in the balance, Captain McConnell of this city and his men were sent out as a body of skirmishers. They found a Federal battery of 12, there's 4 again. As soon as Captain McConnell saw how things stood, he recaptured and seized the gun, although the rebel force was so near our men could hear them talk. Kind of interesting the way these stories go. There's that's not what I know. I wanted to go back to this one. Now, there's a couple little things that I find interesting about this. First, that's one of the reasons why this monument is here. This is another monument dedicated to the 150th New York, and it's located right here where that battery was at the Trostee farm, Bigelow's battery. It's the 9th Massachusetts. It's called the New York unit. It's called Rhode Island. But it was actually the 9th Massachusetts. The second, so basically the 150th is staking its claim. Hey, we took these cannons. This is us. The second thing that is interesting about this is that there was sort of a long history of headbutting between the 150th and the 1st Maryland Potomac Home Guards, the other regiment, about this little fight, because in the official reports, there were competing stories about what actually happened. The 1st Maryland Home Guard, along with the brigade commander, said this was a big fight with the 21st Mississippi. Major fight, bang, bang, stuff going on all over the place. Now, Colonel Ketchum in his report and the Corps commander, Alpheus Williams, basically said, this wasn't much of anything. The Mississippians were already retreating when they started off. And the Marylanders took this as an affront to their credibility. And the New Yorkers said, you guys are just trying to freaking take credit for something that you don't really deserve credit for. So there is some lingering animosity here, which adds another element to that letter of McConnell's. Just find that a very interesting story. Moving on, July 3rd, I got about 5 minutes here, so I will just close off with the 150 and then a brief discussion about what's going on at Culp's Hill. So Culp's Hill on the morning of the 150th. I should add that the 150th stayed back where they were with those cannons until 9 o'clock. Then they were ordered back to their original position where the red line just went in. And they were there until about 2 o'clock in the morning when firing started back up around Spangler Spring. So they were awake. About 6 o'clock in the morning, they were ordered to move in support of the units on Culp's Hill. And they spent most of the day going back and forth. About 6:30, they actually went into the line to relieve the 78th New York. At 10 o'clock, they were relieved by the 102nd New York. The 150th came back to rearm, refuel, get ready to go. And an hour later, at 11 o'clock, they went back into line and took the place of the 102nd. About an hour and a half later, the 150th was pulled out of line again in preparation to go over to Cemetery Ridge to repulse Pickett's charge. They started to move, but by the time they got over there, the charge was over with. It's on this fight on Culp's Hill that the 150th lost a number of soldiers. These are the casualties of the 150th. I got to thank Betsy Strauss, another trustee here at the Historical Society, who sent me the pictures of 2 soldiers, John Wing and John Van Alsten, from Amenia, who were both killed relatively early in the fight at Culp's Hill. Other soldiers that died there, there was one from Poughkeepsie, one from Dover, one from Fishkill, a couple that we don't really know, but there was a wide variety. 2 days ago, I made one last trip to the Poughkeepsie Rural Cemetery, and I literally was just walking along, and I saw, oh, Charlie Weaver died age 32. Like, well, wait a second. He was in Company B, 150th. Whoa, what's going on? Well, this is the same Charlie Weaver that was wounded at Gettysburg, and he's buried in the Poughkeepsie Rural Cemetery. I just happened to see it was serendipitous. He was right there. All in all, the 150th lost 7 men killed. Two men died of wounds, 21 were wounded, and 15 were missing or captured. They lost 45 men at Culp's Hill. They did not lose any in that first fight that I mentioned a minute ago. I'm going to go through these fairly quickly in time. This is just a copy of the official report of Ketchum. One thing he did say that's kind of interesting in the standard rah, not a man faltered. The average number of rounds of ammunition expended by each man was 150. But if you look at the reports of the battle, this is from the Titus papers here at the Historical Society. At Gettysburg, that, the company that Titus was in, I Company, they only expended 1,840 rounds, which if you extrapolate, that's maybe 27 rounds per soldier. So Ketchum might have been exaggerating a little bit when he talked about every soldier firing 150 rounds. This is just another, one of the things that I learned from the newspapers. The big story right after Gettysburg was the draft riots. And 3 officers from the 150th were sent back to Poughkeepsie to bring in the newly drafted soldiers. Major Henry Gildersleeve, who went on to become a New York State Supreme Court Justice, and Lieutenant Robert Mooney, who was also buried in the Poughkeepsie Rural Cemetery. 47 years old, made it through the entire war. The battle of during Pickett's charge, both the 80th and the 111th were involved, though not necessarily in significant fashions. The 111th was in the second line of defense, sort of on the right-hand side. For reference, the copse of trees, the center, the high water mark of the Confederacy is right here. And the 111th is sort of on the very northern end of the war. They lost about 10 to 15% of their remaining soldiers that they had during this fight, some from the cannonade that preceded the battle, some from the actual combat itself. And the 80th was, again, just to the south, a little bit more involved, and actually was involved in a brief charge against the remains of Pickett's division, the brigade of, Kemper's brigade. They suffered about another 40 to 50 casualties during this fight, but were recognized by the division commander. It is General Stannard, who commanded the Vermont Brigade over here, and Colonel Gates, that the country is mainly indebted for the repulse of Pickett's charge. In the absence of time, I'm not going to go through this. This is just another, the connection here. This is my Nebraska connection for anybody out there in Nebraska. This is a soldier whose wife, he ended up migrating to, or moving to Chicago. When he died, his wife ended up moving to Lincoln. I don't know why, but she died in 1906. Her last place of residence was 1016 F Street, which is about 2 blocks away from the Capitol building in Lincoln. But we will move on from there. If you visit Gettysburg, this is where the monuments are. I've got these portraits, and I will include this in an upcoming article in the Dutchess County Yearbook. But if you want to see where these units fought, these are the locations you go to be in kind of the center of where everything is. Now, I've kind of rushed it there at the end, but I will stick around if anybody's got any questions. I hope you have enjoyed this. I have tried to do justice to as many different Dutchess County soldiers as I have. I know I am forgetting some folks. I know that I could do this for another 2 hours, but I thank you for your patience in watching what we have. Thank you for your continued support, everybody out there, for the Dutchess County Historical Society. Get involved with local history, whether it's here, one of your local chapters, one of the historical houses. Do something. There is so much fascinating here in the Hudson Valley. It isn't even funny. Dutchess County is gold. So thank you. Oh, excellent.
Great.
I just flipped over here. So in your, Okay, Andrea, you asked in your research, were you able to uncover reasons why these men enlisted and what they believed they were fighting for? I will give two answers. One of them is going to be sort of a cop out that I wasn't really looking at that at this stage. Eventually, I do kind of want to focus on that. However, saying that I wasn't really looking for that, I did find a few elements. Some things that I've noticed. Number one, the idea of initially enlisting for service in country, for service to the country. I mentioned Martin Van Buren Brouwer. His letters from 1861 are fairly similar of some of the diaries I've read. For love of country, I'm willing to lay down my life for the unity of for the country. One of the things that I find interesting, and this is one that I really wanted to develop. I don't have all the answers, but I've got a lot of questions. As we get into 1863 and 1864, the question of, abolition of slavery, where does that fit? And I see some, I'm not going to say anecdotal, but it's more indirect evidence that is becoming more important. What do I mean by indirect evidence? There are a number of references of Dutchess County men leaving their units to take up commissioned officers' positions or other positions in colored regiments. There are, in reading the Poughkeepsie, I haven't read all of the Poughkeepsie Eagles, but I did a quick scan of July, August, and September 1863. And there are a lot of references. What do I mean by a lot? Maybe one every 3 or 4 days of the colored militia drilling. The colored militia is going to have a fundraiser, and I'm using the terminology that was used in the time. There are letters to the editor that are questioning how colored troops should be used. Not necessarily in a derogatory way, but asking questions, how do we incorporate them into the efforts of the war? So I do detect that there was a shift in attitude, but I have not done enough research to really dig into how and why that was. I hope that answered your question at least a little bit, Andrea. Yes, I absolutely could, Mike. Be more than happy to. And I can point out where that is as well. So, yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Rhonda. Again, that's a great question. And I was talking to Bill a couple days ago, again, looking through this is not, again, not something I have done a lot of research on. Well, a lot, I haven't really done any. But as I noticed reading the newspapers, one of the things, I'm going to go a little bit off topic and bring it back, I promise. One of the things that surprised me about reading the Poughkeepsie Eagle newspapers for those 3 months was there was not a lot about Gettysburg. What I thought, it almost seemed like there was more about Vicksburg. Part of the reason was the two other Dutchess County affiliated regiments, the 128th and the 159th, fought in that campaign. They fought at Port Hudson, so they were not at Vicksburg, but they were sending reports in weekly to the Poughkeepsie Eagle. There was all sorts of stuff on the 128th and 127th. Now, why do I mention that? Well, the next biggest topic seemed to be the draft riots. So in terms of effects, I don't know, but I can tell you that the newspaper, the Poughkeepsie Eagle, for those 3 months, every day there's a report about the draft riots. Every day there is a report about how those draft riots were affecting people in Dutchess County. Far more articles about the draft riots than there were about battlefield developments. I found that interesting. Again, that is one of those questions that deserves a whole lot more attention than I've been able to give it right now. But so yes, I am highly confident there was a significant influence, but I am not very confident about what that influence is. can you shed any light on the problem of establishing? Oh, how much time do we got? Yeah, this was an issue, and it was recognized as an issue by leaders. It was there were the challenges were sort of twofold. Number one, you wanted to, if you were in the Union, this is more a Union than a Confederate problem. I'm sorry, I should say, can you shed any light on the problem of establishing new regiments for political reasons rather than recruiting men to fill losses in established regiments? So at the state level, governors had to try to figure out ways to get political support. One of the best ways to get political support is, I'm going to let you form a regiment. Hey, John Ketchum, I'm going to let you form a regiment in Dutchess County. It's going to be called the Dutchess County Regiment. It's going to be yours. That's great. The 1,000 men that go into the 150th New York, they're going to be raw. They're going to be green. They are not going to have the experience of going into other units that have experienced soldiers in. The flip side of that is there's a recognition that you ideally, yeah, you want raw recruits to go into these experienced units. But for the most part, it's hard to do. Most of your experienced soldiers, if you were in a unit that has seen a lot of action by 1863, you've had a lot of casualties. There aren't many there aren't many people left. The 57th, like I said, they went into battle with 175 men. Normal regimental strength in a perfect world, and none of the regiments were perfect, was 1,000. There is less connection between people and that regiment. Now, there are exceptions. Oftentimes, if you had a regiment that was very renowned and well known, and the best example I can think of this is honestly the Iron Brigade, that had tremendous reputations for bravery. They were a unique unit. It's much easier to get recruits to fill those roles, but much harder to do so. So there is a balance. Another way you can do that is by offering bounties. Hey, we will give you a sign-up bounty of $50 if you enlist. That can work sometimes. Another little interesting thing that's a sidebar. There were about 50 people from Dutchess County that enlisted in the 95th New York in August of 1864. All young men. I don't know why. None of them were at Gettysburg, obviously, but what did the 95th, and I haven't done a lot of research on the 95th, what did the 95th do in order to get these men to join up? Okay, thanks, Bill. I appreciate that. I did not know that that was a policy. I know that a lot of states wanted to do that, just found it political inexpedient. And for those, the second, the sixth, and the seventh Wisconsin were part of the Iron Brigade. Some of the examples that I just gave. So, yeah, that's a great point. Any other questions? What other questions? Okay. All right. Well, I will just offer again my final thank you so much to everybody. Thank you for your support of the Historical Society. You can find my email. I teach at DCC. If anybody thinks of another question, you can go on the DCC website. My email address is there. Send me a note. If I have, Mike Peets just mentioned, if there's stuff that I got wrong, if there's stuff that I'm missing, if you can add elements to what I have, please let Bill Jeffway, please let the Historical Society know. Photocopies, anything will be very, very, very useful. Oh, hey, enjoy North Carolina, Bill. Thank you so much for joining us. But all right, Bill, that's all I got. Thank you.